Taking Care of You, Managing Stress and Depression, Part 1, presented by Dr. Michael Howard.
This is about dealing with an ongoing stressor for a very, very long period of time. And what the stress response is, how it works, how it leads to anxiety, and leads to probably 2/3 of all depressions, and when it's a very natural thing for every one of us in this room. As I'm looking around at you right now, every one of you are from the Stone Age. Your bodies and brains have not really changed in any significant manner for 13,000, 14,000 years, since you were nomadic hunter-gatherers living in the Stone Age back then. And basically, your emotional responses we're going to talk about have developed in us, and in all animals too. You know, your dog has about as many emotions as you have. A lot more than a cat. Now that's for you cat people, all right? I'm going to try to help you understand that here pretty quickly. But what we're talking about here really is emotions, and that really is kind of what this whole stress deal is all about. Everybody is sitting in this room is sitting right now on a hair trigger for fear. Our species lives on a hair trigger for fear to go into a stress response. When I lived in San Marcos before, I'm back in San Marcos, Texas now, but I lived there before about 12, 15 years ago. And we lived out in the south side of town with big old yards and everything and no fences, and there's little herds of deer all over the place out there, little white-tailed deer hang out. What does it take to startle a deer? Almost nothing. I mean, this little thing, all 8 or 10 of them are off running off someplace like, yeah, because they're scared to death of practically anything that happens to you. That's a really important thing to keep in mind, because that's really everybody in this room. We kind of sit like that. It's about emotions, and it's about thinking, and it's about perception, where all this stuff about stress, anxiety, and depression comes from. And I got this little picture up here on the screen to remind you that basically stress doesn't live in your foot. On the front of this little guy up here, that you can see kind of right up in here in this front area up in here. We call this frontal lobe up here on the top up here. This guy up here and a little piece of brain down deep down here are going to be enormously important in all the discussion we're going to have the rest of the day, since you've seen this stuff about brain pictures and all that stuff up there already. A couple, 3 parts of this brain that are going to become really important in our discussion today. And the first is where the stress response begins, and you heard a lot about that this morning. That's this little guy right there called the hypothalamus. Now, you heard a lot of talk this morning about the pituitary gland, the anterior pituitary and the hormones that stuck out. Remember that? You know where the pituitary is located? It's directly attached to that little booger right there. It's directly attached to your hypothalamus. As a matter of fact, the hypothalamus tells it pretty much everything it does. It's a little slave. It's called the master gland. It ain't the master of nothing. The hypothalamus tells it pretty much everything it's supposed to do. This is an amazing little piece of your brain here. It's got about 20, 25 nuclei in there, and they all do a bunch of different stuff, and a lot of them are different size, shape, and density in males and females. The sexuality of your brain kind of begins right in this little guy in here. About your difference between you think males and females have different brains? Oh, please. Hello. You know, they have different. Did you know every one of you in here was actually conceived with the brain and body of one sex? There's a default sex for humans. Every one of you was conceived as one sex. Which one? Males? Are you kidding? Who'd want to be conceived as a male? No, female. Everybody here was pretty much conceived with the brain of one sex. And then in the little bitty Y chromosome, and the little male fetus developing, there's a gene called the SRY gene that kicks in about 8 weeks into fetal development and begins to create the testes. The little testes start growing that fetus, and them little suckers start kicking out what? Testosterone. And then testosterone proceeds to ruin a perfectly good female brain and turn it into a male brain. Now, that's kind of important, because when we talk about stress, anxiety, and depression, do you think one sex is more vulnerable to these? This is important to understand. Do you think so? Kind of goes back to our Stone Age stuff too, in a way. There are 8 anxiety disorders in the new DSM-5. That's kind of our Bible for diagnosing. They just came out last month, as a matter of fact, the new version of this up there. And there are 8 anxiety disorders in there. Things like panic disorder and obsessive compulsive disorder and social phobias and specific phobias and generalized anxiety disorder and acute stress disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder. They're all anxiety disorders. And they're all based on one emotion out of control. What is it? Fear. It's all based on fear. Fear out of control. You don't know, you may not know this, but the anxiety disorders are nothing but the stress response gone to the 99.9 percentile. That's just stress out of control that morphs into all these little directions that we call anxiety disorders. They're all based on fear, and we treat them all exactly the same. Same treatment models work for all of them. We change the content, but the model are all the same because they're all based on stress and fear, all based. Well, these anxiety disorders, you know, 6 of the 8 of them occur twice as much in one sex as the other. Which one? Females. Females. Social phobia and OCD occur equally between the sexes, but the other occur twice as much in females as in males. How about depression? Is there a sex deal in depression? Is there a sex difference in depression? What do you think? Actually, it's a trick question. How many puberties do you have? 2 is right. You know, you're born in puberty, actually. Female babies are bathed in the various estrogens, you know, estradiol, estrone, estradiol, and all that for at least probably 10 to 18 months, depends on the kid. And males are bathed in testosterone until you're born for about 6 months before it shuts down. And then comes the one Greg was talking about, that second puberty in which all life changes. the second. Well, up until that second puberty, by the way, when does puberty now occur in American girls? 12 years and 5 months. You know, that's 2 years earlier than the end of World War I. Those are epigenetic changes that are occurring in us. Girls are hitting puberty. Boys hit puberty a bit after that one there. Up until then, more boys get depression than girls. Not many more, but more. Once the second puberty hits in, all the way to perimenopause, beginning about age 42, in those reproductive years, 2 women get depression for every guy. All right? So we're talking about something that basically, who is more likely to end up being direct caregivers? Women. Who's more likely to develop anxiety, stress, and depression? Women. This is a deal. There is a tremendous, that doesn't mean guys don't get it. It doesn't mean guys don't become caregivers, but it means that women are more vulnerable to this. There's no question about it. Also, some of the meds we talked about this morning for depression, for example, actually work better in females than males, and some work better in males than females. Let's suppose you get depressed. And whoever diagnosed you with depression is going to pull out a prescription pad for you. What do you think is going to go on that prescription pad? 12 episodes of cognitive behavioral therapy? In your dreams. Managed care doesn't want you to get psychotherapy. Managed care wants you to get a what? A medication. And 80% of the time, it's going to be one class of medications called an SSRI, specific serotonin, you heard about that this morning, reuptake inhibitor. It's going to be Paxil, Zoloft, Prozac, Luvox, Celexa, Lexapro, Viagra. It's going to be one of these things you're going to get on there for a couple of reasons. You know why? And it's not just because they're cheaper or generic. Why? Because they have slightly less side effects in the average person, if there's such a thing, than the others, and women respond to them better than men. About 8, 9 studies tell us that now. Because these are kind of female disorders we're talking about today. They're based on emotion. What is an emotion? Feelings. What's a feeling? I could play Socrates with you all over the place, just ask you, what is that, because pretty soon you run out of answers because there's almost no synonym for these things. I mean, but I'll tell you something about emotions. They tend to be kind of brief. You don't stay angry, really angry, for months at a time, unless you're a wife, probably. That's probably not. That's not. You don't stay angry for until it comes and it goes. And they also tend to be kind of specific. I'm mad at her. I'm not mad at everybody else in this room in here. It's usually focused on one thing. These emotions are kind of short, and they sort of take over your consciousness when they hit you. I mean, they just do you in. Now, the other thing about these emotions are they direct our attention to things that are important to us. something we don't want to be around or something we want. It directs our attention to them, and it begins to motivate us to do one thing, to get away from it, to acquire it, to do something, and we start getting changes in our body when we feel these emotions. They cause changes in our body, so we can do something about whatever it is that's all firing us up about this. How many basic emotions do you think there are? I'll tell you something you may not believe, but there are 6 basic emotions that every human being in this planet, unless you got a Bell's palsy, you can't move your face, or Parkinson's or something, every person on this planet, when you feel these 6 emotions, you're going to have the same, your 43 facial muscles are going to make the very same response to it as every other person on this planet. Is that weird or what? Like Darwin taught us back in the early 1800s, emotions are ubiquitous across everybody. Like I say, your dog feels pretty much the same ones that you do. There are 6 emotions, if you feel them, you're going to have the same facial expressions every other person on this planet. They're probably your 6 basic emotions. What do you think they are? Anger. Fear. Actually, I'll tell you something. You said hurt. Hurt feelings is an emotion that there's no synonym for in 14 languages. They tried to find a synonym for hurt feelings. When somebody betrays you that you really have trust in, and you get those hurt feelings because of that, there's no other word that describes that except hurt feelings. But it's not one of the basic emotions because you don't have the same facial expression to it. But fear and anger are 2 of them. Sadness. What's the polar opposite of sadness? Happiness. Yeah, you got 4 of them. Doing good. You can bet in 666 you can, make the Hall of Fame. What? What else? I'll give you the last 2. They're tough. Surprise and disgust. Now you tell me something. How many of those 6 basic emotions are negative emotions? 5 is correct. Is surprise a negative emotion? Surprise, when you're first surprised by something, you're frightened by it at first. And then, it's a surprise party. Oh, it's just cool. I'll get some presents. It's okay now. But when that's for surprise, why do you think those 5 emotions are negative? So you could survive back in the Stone Age. That's why. And this particular fear, we sit on a hair trigger for fear. A hair trigger for it. Because things that threatened us back then, back thousands of years ago, put us in a situation that we call the fight or flight response. It comes from an old Harvard guy maybe back 100 years ago. Fight or flight response, we're going to do something about this thing, and our bodies get ready for this. We jump into a fear and a stress response like lightning because your brain comes hardwired for it. That little hypothalamus right down here I just told you about, this little guy right down here, this little hypothalamus right here, when fear hits that hypothalamus, it throws you into a stress response so fast, it can happen even without your thinking about it. That's how serious this is. Your brain comes hardwired for you to go into a stress response, and where that comes from is fear generated by a little piece of your brain right there called the amygdala. Now you have 2 of them actually. This is your left one over here. You got a right one on the other side. But the fear, when fear comes up in this amygdala, and most of your negative emotions, by the way, come from this little thing called the amygdala. Do you know that? That's where most of these 5 negative emotions come from. We know that because of some really fascinating studies that have been done on people that have had their amygdala removed. One gal, probably the one most famous in the literature, her initials are SM. She's still alive. She's about 50 years old. Back when she was in her 20s, she had bilateral malignant tumors on both the right and left amygdala, and the neurosurgeons went in and did a bilateral amygdalectomy. They cut the little boogers out. So afterward, she's got no amygdala left. You know what they found out about her after she recovered from this? Nothing irritates her at all. She never gets frustrated by anything. She never gets angry. I wanted to marry her when I heard about this. As soon as I found out about that, I got to tell you, I was trying to court her somewhere. I couldn't find her. She never shows any fear. Nothing surprises her. Do you think that she could live on her own? Now, everything else, the brain seems to work pretty good. You think she could live on her own if she couldn't feel those negative emotions? You see, what's happened is her negative emotions have packed up their bags and left. She can't even recognize, she couldn't even pass the Doris Day test. Oh, now I suppose you want to know what that is. Want to know what the Doris Day test is? There's a little article in the Annals of Neurology, one of the neurology journals years ago. It was about this long, just on a back page, and the headline on top was, SM cannot pass the Doris Day test. Well, what happened was she was watching a movie one night, an old Hitchcock flick with, it's called The Man Who Knew Too Much. It's with Jimmy Stewart and Doris Day. One of Doris Day's rare dramatic roles when she was kind of younger. And in the movie, her child gets kidnapped. And when it happens, she's in this hotel room. She finds out her kid's kidnapped. And she just goes into kind of hissy fit. She's throwing things around the room and she didn't know what to do about it. And when SM saw that, she turned to the person next to her and said, what's she doing? Because she can't even recognize a negative emotion in another person. She can't even describe to you what fear is. So the amygdala is where this comes from. And sitting right next to the amygdala is the hippocampus, right there. And they're very heavily attached to each other. And the amygdala is directly attached to your hypothalamus. What do you think that hippocampus does? What did you have for breakfast? What did you have for breakfast?
English muffin.
English muffin. What kind of car you drive? Toyota. English muffin and Toyota. You wouldn't know that if you didn't have a hippocampus. The hippocampus takes information from your short-term consciousness memory and somehow, in a way we don't really fully understand this, turns this into long-term memory networks to be mostly encode back in the back of your cerebral cortex back here. So everything you know that's a fact, the hippocampus, like the keyboard of your computer and hitting the save icon, the hippocampus put it into your brain. Without a hippocampus, you cannot learn a new fact of any kind, way, shape, or form, period. You know how we know that? By another poor surgical guy. We used to know him by his initials, HM. We now know his name is Henry Gustav Malayason because he died about 5 years ago. And when he was at age 27, as a child, he'd had a bicycle accident and had a traumatic brain injury. And guess where he had 2 bleeds in the brain, right around his right and left hippocampus. He began to have post-traumatic seizures, like Dr. Oshanik was telling you about, in the teens, into the 20s. By the time he got to the late, about age 26 or 27, he was having seizure after seizure after seizure, status epilepticus, we call that, every once in a while. And so the neurosurgeons went in. There was EEGs back then. That's about the only test we had to really look at, see what the brain did back in the 1950s. They found the EEG, and they found the focus of his seizures was basically in his right and left. So they took out both his right and left hippocampus. Just cut that sucker out on both sides. After that, he was never able to learn an unrelated fact for the rest of his life. And not only that, wasn't able to recall any information up to 2 years before they cut it out. So without a hippocampus, you can't put any factual information into your brain. But sitting right next to it is the amygdala. That's where the negative emotions of your memories come from. Not from your hippocampus, they come from the amygdala. It comes from a whole different place. And what do you think drives chronic stress, chronic anxiety, and chronic depression? What do you think makes that happen? Powerful. Now, you heard him talk about PTSD this morning. What do you think causes PTSD? Post-traumatic stress disorder. What do you think causes it? Back in 1978, when I was an intern at Topeka VA Hospital, I'm an ex-Vietnam vet. My boss, Tom Patterson, was a Korean War vet. We started the second PTSD unit in the entire VA system at Topeka VA Hospital. I worked at PTSD for a long time. What causes post-traumatic stress disorder? What?
The inability to forget.
You're absolutely correct. Good for you. Most people would say, oh, it's combat, or it's a rape that happened or something. That's not what causes PTSD. And that's the next big lesson I'm going to try to teach you here.
Not the situation.
Where does anxiety and depression and stress come from? Right here. The world does not stress you. The world does not make you anxious, and the world does not make you depressed. What you perceive and think, and then the emotion you create to that, the fear that comes from that, is what makes you anxious. A very powerful negative traumatic memory that's formed of some event that doesn't dissipate over time. Now, is it true that time cures all ills? You know, most of the time it is. Something really bad happens to you, most of the time, as time goes by, as you dream about it some, as you think about it, it isn't so scary as time goes by. It's not as sad as time goes by. You're not as angry about it as time goes by. But for reasons we can't fully explain, the powerful traumatic memories that are formed in post-traumatic stress disorder don't seem to dissipate over time. And every time that memory comes back in a flashback or nightmare or whenever, it's like you're going through it the very first time you went through it, and you're re-traumatized again and 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 again. So it's a negative emotional memory that causes it. It's the same thing that causes most anxiety and the same thing that causes most traumatic stress. Now, the point I'm trying to get across to you is, this old Stone Age stress response, where fear is activated down here in your amygdala, and it tells this hypothalamus you're afraid, it tells your pituitary gland to kick out a hormone called adrenocorticotropic hormone. It goes down to your adrenal glands sitting on top of your kidneys and tells your adrenal glands, kick out epinephrine, called adrenaline, norepinephrine, some, noradrenaline, also in the brain, and the one that, when I was having breakfast with Carolyn this morning, she said, what can you do about my high cortisol? What can you do about my high cortisol? Carolyn, what did I tell you could do about your high cortisol? Yeah. You notice that. She said, reduce your stress. Now, does that mean getting rid of whatever it is that's stressing you?
No, learn to manage it.
That's correct. She said learn to manage it is the absolute. You see, the world doesn't stress you. You know how long we've known that? Did you ever see the movie Gladiator? Yeah. Remember in the first of the movie Gladiator, the old guy Richard Harris played Marcus Aurelius, one of the great emperors of Rome who wrote Meditations, one of the great things that were written about the Roman Empire. Marcus Aurelius, most of what he became was due to one person, a great Greek Stoic philosopher called Epictetus, who was his teacher and his mentor most of the time that he was the emperor of Rome. Let me tell you what Epictetus wrote 2,000 years ago. He said, we are not disturbed by things. We are disturbed by our perception of things. Stress, anxiety, and depression you create right inside your head. The world doesn't stress you. The world doesn't make you anxious, and the world doesn't make you depressed. What we perceive, how we perceive that world and what we think about that world up here in your frontal lobes becomes the key issue. Your frontal lobes of your brain have a tremendous inhibition function. In other words, let's suppose you've got an impulse to do something, a powerful impulse to do it. Your frontal lobes tell you do the hard thing when it's the right thing. Okay? Well, that's telling me inhibit that impulse, and the frontal lobes are able to do that. Also, I may be sitting here feeling right now really angry about something, but my frontal lobes can inhibit my amygdala right around this pathway called the anterior cingulate gyrus. It's directly connected to it, actually. My frontal lobes can inhibit those negative emotions and tell those negative emotions to cool it, calm down. So you're learning a huge lesson here when it comes to stress, just by looking at this brain. A stress, anxiety, and depression key thing. What you think can inhibit your negative emotions. But if you don't use your frontal lobes to inhibit them, your negative emotions can overwhelm your thinking and can dominate your thinking. You know, it's like, did you ever learn to ride a horse? You ever ride a horse? When you first get on that horse, who's in charge? That sucker goes wherever it wants to. I mean, when I was raised on a farm, first time I was like 12 years old. Like, if this thing goes where it wants to go. But once you learn to use your knees and use your feet and use the reins, you can control the horse. What you do when it comes to stress, anxiety, and depression, you use you in this saddle to control that horse, these negative emotions that are coming out down here. You understand how important that is? Your thinking can overwhelm these things. Let me tell you what the real issue is here. Your stress response doesn't know the difference between something that's really threatening you, which is designed to protect you from, or an imaginary threat. We human beings, because of the huge frontal lobes we've grown compared to every other species on this planet, even our closest genetic relative, chimpanzee, chimpanzees share 98.4% of our DNA. But that 1.6% difference, Where do you think most of that is? It's the changes in this huge brain we got up here, especially these frontal lobes. These frontal lobes we got allow us to conjure, you can time travel. You ain't got to go see Star Trek movies to time travel. What are you going to do this evening? That's you I ask right here. I ain't yelling at you now, I'm just asking you a question. What are you going to do this evening?
Eat or go to sleep.
What, mean you're going to drive home, or are you going to leave here? What are you going to do this evening?
Stay here.
You're going to stay here this evening? Well, you just time traveled. Because you are imagining that event right now inside your head, and it's never happened. We're the only species on this planet that we know of that can literally time travel ourselves to another place and think about what we're going to do a year from now, or a month from now, or that trip we're going to take in 3 or 4 weeks, and it becomes reality for us inside of our heads. There's a real incredible impact of this when it comes to why we get stressed, anxious, and depressed. If you're sitting there thinking, or for example, let's say that you're walking out here in the boonies and you're about to step down and there's a nice eastern diamondback rattlesnake right there. Now, snake phobia is probably present in 95 to 96% of all humans. If I dropped a non-poisonous snake into a chair beside you, nearly everybody in this room would go into a full-blown phobic fear response. And that amygdala, the fear from that amygdala would put you right directly into a stress response, just like lightning. That would happen just like lightning. But if you're sitting there thinking, oh, tonight, let's see, my daughter's going to borrow the car for a date. Yeah, she'll probably get pregnant. When the fear from that hits your hypothalamus, it doesn't know the difference. And that event hasn't even happened yet. The point is, when that, oh my God, my kid's going to get pregnant, maybe hits this thing down here, that hypothalamus thinks, geez, we're being attacked by a rattlesnake or being attacked by a saber-toothed tiger, for crying. It doesn't know the difference. So you can respond with a stress response to completely imaginary stressors that don't even exist. Now, a lot of times they do. And most of the people in this room live with stressors that are real. And you know what they are. A lot more than a lot of folks have to live with. But what you think about that stressor, the stressor is kind of the stuff in the environment, what you think about that stressor is where your stress, anxiety, and depression is going to come from. Understand? There are 3 ways that stress, there are 4 ways probably that stress develops. First of all, you're just exposed to a chronic stressor over and over again, or a huge extreme stressor of some kind. And you all know about what that's like. You've been through both of them. If you have a loved one that's got a traumatic brain injury, you've been through both of them, the acute stress of it and the long-term stressor out there that you cope with on a day-to-day basis. It's out there. But another thing is, it's how threatening and fearful and worrisome, worry is a word that's fear too, how worrisome this is to you, which can become exaggerated. And whether you think you've got the coping skills to deal with it. And finally, whether you do have the coping skills to deal with it.
To learn more about resources and information provided by our experts, call Brain Injury Association of Florida's helpline at 800-992-3442.